There's a little bit of housekeeping to do to begin with. I want to take a moment to acknowledge two great historians, local historians who've passed. Dr. Tweeten, of course, Jerry Tweeten, and Dr. Richard Berenger, who passed away last week. They were professionals. I, on the other hand, am a dilettante. I happen to become interested in almost any little thing that comes along. And fortunately, history provides a lot of that, a lot of serendipity. This particular presentation is built on last year's presentation, some of you were here, which was called March 1919. And we're picking up from March 1919 and seeing what happened to the characters and the institutions and the political system that they built. I warn you at the beginning that history does not divide itself in perfect calendar pieces. So, for our purposes, the 20s begin on October 28th, 1921, and end on November 5th or 6th, 1932. Is that okay with everybody? The 20s were an extraordinary decade for a number of reasons. None of them connected with what's in our popular imagination about the Roaring Twenties. The 20s were very unsettled in North Dakota, economically and politically and just about every other way. But morally, things were pretty straight. And we'll see that displayed in the slideshow. The first part of this is a sort of rapid-fire look at the personalities of the 20s and who they were, what happened to them. I need somebody to count the casualties. There was an extraordinary amount of political turnover in the decade. Starting with these two guys, Baer versus Burtness. John M. Baer was the cartoonist for the Nonpartisan League. Some people argue that he was almost single-handedly responsible for its success, which overlooks a few other people. But he was a brilliant cartoonist who could make a point very quickly and very effectively. He was elected to Congress, and in 1920 became the first of the League casualties. Casualty number one. He was defeated by Ulgar Burtness of Grand Forks, one of several Grand Forks characters that we're going to meet today. Ulgar Burtness was a Norwegian immigrant born just west of town, very prominent on campus in the 1890s and early 1900s. He is the person for whom Burtness Theater at UND is named. He was a debater, the founder of the Sock and Buskin Society on campus, and a bit of a dramatist. He served in Congress until the early 1930s. So he established a pretty secure, stable political career.
What was that society?
The Sock and Buskin Society, it was for people in drama. Members of the House. This says more about the person who made the PowerPoint than any other of my slides. You'll notice that the pictures are not all the same size. I really struggled to make them the same size. So we have Burtness. These are the members of the House of Representatives from North Dakota during the 1920s. We have Burtness. Next to him is John M. Young. Next to him is Thomas Hall, who was also later Secretary of State. And last, we have someone that I bet you nobody here has ever heard of. Congressman from 1918 to 1932, represented the 3rd Congressional District. James Sinclair. Did you know that name? From Kenmare. The 3rd District was the western third of the state, basically. These two guys succeeded each other in the 2nd District. And Burtness represented the 1st district, which included Grand Forks and Fargo, a little bit more of the Red River Valley. And the 2nd district was the central part of the state, and the 3rd district, the far west. Linn J Frazier from Hoople and Rangvold A. Nestos. Frazier was the League's governor, elected in 1916. Nestos came to the United States, a remarkable story, came to the United States at age 16, enrolled in the 1st grade at Buxton, not speaking a word of English. He came from Voss in Norway. 4 years later, he graduated from UND, and a year and a half or so after that, he had a law degree. He homesteaded in Pierce County and then set himself up in Minot as an attorney. Pointed at the screen? Oh. This is the vote in the recount election, which was held on October 28th, 1921. 4,100 votes. Nestos had been chosen as the so-called regular Republican candidate that actually organizes the Independent Voters Association because he had 2 great, well, maybe 3 great attributes as far as regular Republicans were concerned. First, he spoke Norwegian. Second, he lived in western North Dakota. And the League was stronger in the West than in the East. Third, he was not married, and so he had no distractions. He was a hard-charging, ambitious politician. Should the Bank of North Dakota be abolished and its assets be liquidated? Yes, 101,000, no, 105,000. So in that election, they threw out the League's officers, the governor, the attorney general, and the agriculture commissioner, but upheld the law that established the bank. So Nestos had an immediate dilemma, and his decision was, we're going to make this thing work. Very conservative management, no real expansion, but also no effort to close the bank, or importantly for Grand Forks, the mill and elevator. He probably could have gotten away with it. Certainly the legislature, which turned heavily independent, they called themselves, would probably have joined him in abolishing the bank. Lemke versus Johnson. Lemke was the Attorney General, the 2nd Attorney General in the League administration. The first was Bill Langer, whom we'll hear more of later. Sven Johnson was born in Iceland, came to Grand Forks, and practiced law here. He was the city attorney for Grand Forks when he was tapped to run for Attorney General in the 1921 recall election. Frazier ran for the Senate in 1922. A year and 2 months after he'd been removed from office, he was elected to the US Senate, defeating Porter J. McCumber, who had served since 1896. What? Now I got to do the math. The election was in 1896. I know, 1890. Oh, it doesn't make any difference. 24 years anyway. 1898. In the primary, this was in the Republican primary. For the first time in a popular election, a Democrat came pretty close to being elected to the Senate. There had been a Democrat who served when legislators elected senators. Nathaniel Roach, the mayor of Larimore. The Democratic candidate is somebody you probably have heard of, J.F.T. O'Connor, who had a brilliant career as a federal jurist, but before he settled on that career, he practiced law here in Grand Forks and ran as the Democratic candidate for the Senate in 1922. Nestos beat him by about 4 percentage points. The closest any Democrat came to being popularly elected until 1960. Well, Moses, however, ran as a fusion candidate in the 40s. Nestos versus Sorley. Sorley Bridge is named for Arthur Gustav Sorley, who is the only member of the Grand Forks City Council ever elected governor of the state. He defeated Nestos in 1924, restoring the nonpartisan league. Now, this seems strange, of course, because not only was Sorley living in Grand Forks, but he operated a feed and seed business and a lumberyard. Not exactly the kind of person that you would expect to be elected as a leaguer. And in fact, there was a huge fight over his nomination. But he did win. We're going to pause here for just a second. Oh, anybody counting the casualties? So far, we have 1 U.S. senator, 1 member of the House of Representatives, and 2 governors defeated for re-election as incumbents. Class 3 refers to the formality in the U.S. Senate. There are 3 classes of senators, and Class 1 is elected 1 year, Class 2 the next year, Class 3 the next year. We have Class 1 senators and Class 3 senators in North Dakota, decided arbitrarily at statehood. So here we have the other Senate seat, as we would refer to it. The gentlemen here are Osla Jagrona, one of the little group of willful men who prevented the entry of the United States into the League of Nations. Wilson excoriated him at every opportunity. He was defeated by this fellow, Edwin F. Ladd, the president of North Dakota Agricultural College at the time, a cereal grain specialist. His contribution that led the league to push him forward was that he proved that the mills were short weighting and downgrading North Dakota wheat. He died after a relatively short time in office. And this fellow, whom you've all heard of, Gerald P. Nye, was appointed to the Senate by Arthur Gustav Sorley. He was a newspaperman in Cooperstown, and historians are still scratching their heads about how he got the job. It seems, in some accounts, to have been almost whimsical. He was the editor of the Nonpartisan League paper, but he had been quite critical of Sorley. The most likely explanation is that the other alternative was Bill Lemke, who had been, of course, the League Attorney General and was probably, if not the most radical of the League triumvirate, at least the most able. He was the author of the bank bill and the mill and elevator bill, and he remained important in North Dakota history until Memorial Day in 1951, when he died in the lobby of the Powers Hotel in Fargo. Gerald Nye, of course, is notorious in American history for the America First movement, an isolationist, blamed World War I on munitions makers. He was defeated for re-election in 1940. Here's Walter J. Murdock, yet another Grand Forks County native who made it in politics in North Dakota. I love his hair, don't you? Some of you know Jim Fugly, who's a dilettante historian like myself. This guy and Thomas Moody, who was governor in the mid-30s, are competitors for best hair among governors. I should have thought of that doing this. I could have put Moody in the slideshow. But Murdock has hair. He was born in Washington Township. You know where that is. Educated here in Grand Forks. And in 1911, entered the lottery for a homestead on the Fort Berthold Reservation in Montreux County. And so he moved his family to Plaza, and that became the center of his activity. He was the floor leader in the State House of Representatives when it passed the bank bill. He was defeated. He succeeded sorely, as he was the lieutenant governor. He was defeated for election in 1928 by George Schaefer, not a relative of the Ed Schaefer, whom we all know, but Schaefer, North Dakota, which was once the county seat of McKenzie County, is named for him. Perhaps the most conservative governor North Dakota has ever had. He was closed-minded, tight-fisted, and unfriendly. Not that that would be a definition of conservative, of course. So here are the Grand Forks connections whom we've met so far. Olger Burtness, member of Congress. Sven-Bjorn Johnson, Attorney General, later Justice of the State Supreme Court. Later, after that, active in Illinois politics. J.F.T. O'Connor, whom we've talked about, he went on to a career in California, grew quite wealthy. Arthur Gustav Sorley, Walter Murdock, F. Halsey Armstrong, Ambrose. Anybody know who he is? The pastor of the Presbyterian Church and the Ku Klux Klan. Armstrong essentially organized the business community in Grand Forks as a unit of the Ku Klux Klan, on the pretext that Catholics were taking over the public schools. Now, the school board included a number of university wives. Gillette's wife was on the school board, for example. And the president of the city commission was a man named O'Keefe. A familiar name in Grand Forks, right? Of course, he was a Catholic. So he was one of the targets. The other interesting thing that happened, and the reason I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing that happened was that Armstrong vigorously opposed a bill in the 1923 legislature that would have banned wearing masks in public. Have we heard about this kind of legislation lately? Yes, we have. Kelly Armstrong, now the U.S. Congressman, sponsored a bill that would have forbidden covering your face at a demonstration, right? Well, this bill was aimed, the bill in 1923 was aimed squarely at F. Halsey Armstrong. What? Ambrose. I'm sorry. That was no slur intended on either man. Ambrose disliked Nestos. Even though Nestos was a good Norwegian Lutheran, because he refused to sign, or I'm sorry, he refused to veto the mask bill. And so Ambrose, who to a degree depended on masks at these conclaves that he held at such places as Arvilla, Larimore, when there was a Tri-City conclave at Hillsborough when the Fargo clan came up, joined the locals, and the Grand Forks group went down there. There is a relevant connection here because Lemke was an opponent of the Klan. Sorley was probably a member of the Klan. It's not quite 100% sure. There is an affidavit that says something to the effect of, as of this date, April 12th, 1924, whatever, Arthur G. Sorley is not a member of the Klan, which is sort of reverse evidence that before that he probably was. In any case, he didn't explicitly reject the Klan. He was critical in Maddock's defeat in 1928 because Maddock was outspokenly anti-League. He happened to be a Catholic, and so he felt directly threatened. In any case, the upshot of this is that when it came time to appoint a U.S. senator, Lemke was sort of on the sidelines, and Sorley was looking for somebody else to appoint, even though Lemke himself was clearly ambitious for the job, and would very happily have taken it, but Sorley wouldn't give it to him. Bill Langer. Bill Langer held no public office in the decade that we're talking about, from October 28th, 1921, till Election Day in November 1932. That's the day that he returned to power as governor of the state. Now, he wasn't sitting on his hands by any means. He was in the process of retaking the League and making it into a personal political machine, which he did very effectively. Another Catholic, by the way. Maybe Ambrose knew what he was talking about. Guy's showing up all over the place. A.C. Townley is definitely the man of the past here. He ran for Congress in 1930. I think the only time that his name ever appeared on an election ballot outside of the League itself. He ran against Sinclair in the 3rd District, the western part of the state, and was defeated, sort of launching him on a career of, how should we put this? Quixotic entrepreneurism. He became a faith healer. He became an oil speculator. He got involved in all sorts of unusual things. Charlatan, somebody said. Maddock plus Lemke. They were good friends. Obviously, they had been close allies in the legislature when the League passed its legislation in 1919. While Maddock was governor, so this would be 1927, 28, a new organization appeared in North Dakota, and Maddock became very closely involved with it, the Farmers Union. The Farmers Union had a program that was similar in kind to the League's program. Their goal was to build cooperative enterprises that would serve farmers. So the Farmers Union went around the state organizing grain elevator cooperatives. That became the Grain Terminal Association. oil service cooperatives that became the Farmers Union Oil Company, later Cenex. The GTA is now known as Harvest States. These were producer cooperatives. While Murdock was governor, in the governor's chair, he organized the Plaza Farmers Union Oil Company and the Farmers Union Elevator in Plaza. He went out and organized people to build these, to create these institutions. Lemke was the attorney, the initial attorney for the Farmers Union, as he had been for the NPL, and worked closely with Murdock. Murdock became a Democrat, by the way. After he was rejected for governor, he signed up with the Democrats and became an important Roosevelt administration official in North Dakota. He was the director of the Farm Security Administration, which administered the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So he was very important in North Dakota up until the beginning of World War II, when those sorts of things were no longer quite the issue that they had been in the 30s. There were women in office in 1920. The suffrage amendment passed nationally in 1919. It passed in North Dakota. It was extended to state offices in North Dakota in 1920. After a couple of failures during the teens, it's not true that the League was particularly forward-looking when it came to involving women, other than at picnics. Minnie J. Nielsen, in fact, was a virulent opponent of the League and ran with Alger Burtness's urging for superintendent of public instruction against a guy named Neil C. MacDonald. The issue for Burtness was free love, basically. He accused the Nonpartisan League of introducing the notion of free love in North Dakota schools. Now, I think we have the benefit of hindsight. We know that that can't possibly be true because there are fewer of us in North Dakota now than there were in 1920. But anyway, it was used effectively. She was elected before women got the right to vote in statewide elections, except that the state constitution had one exception, and that was that women were allowed to vote in school elections. And as a consequence, the first woman elected to a statewide office in the United States was superintendent of public instruction in the late 1890s in North Dakota. Laura Eisenmuth was her name. Bertha Palmer, Berta Baker, a close ally of William Langer, part of the Langer machine during the 30s. Initially the treasurer, but later the auditor. Two offices that we're hearing quite a lot about in our current political cycle. Minnie Craig, one of the first two women elected to the legislature. She was a speaker in 1933, again, while Langer, she was a close Langer ally as well, was the governor. Nellie Doherty from Minot, she and Minnie Craig were the first two women elected to the House. Laura Sanderson, Mary McGinnis, Lavina Amsbury, Mabel Lindgren, 6 women elected in the first 10 years of suffrage. Not a particularly good record, particularly because at that same time, Montana was sending women to the U.S. House. Popular democracy. This is the real thing that happened in the 1920s. There were 42 initiated measures on the ballot in the between 1922 and, well, beginning in October 1921 through November 1932. 5 initiated constitutional amendments, 11 referred measures. Now, it was a little bit easier to get things on the ballot in those days. 7,000 signatures for a referendum, 10,000 for an initiative. So here's morality on the ballot. This was a big deal. In 1920, the sale of cigarettes was approved. You'll see the slippery slope beginning here. Rejected motion pictures on Sundays. Approved baseball on Sunday. Close vote. Rejected a commission to allow and regulate boxing as a spectator sport. Approved a ban on displaying red or black flags. That's why I'm wearing this particular tie. A little red, a little black.
Why the black?
Pardon?
Why the black?
Anarchists. Black is the flag of the anarchists, and red the flag of the socialists. The same session, by the way, or just before, the mask law failed to pass. Whoops. Got to back up. 1928, here we implemented women's suffrage. 1928, defeated the repeal of prohibition. 1930, rejected motion pictures on Sundays. Repealed prohibition. Banned corporate ownership of farmland. This is Bill Lemke's third great contribution or great influence on the state. The first is the Bank of North Dakota. He wrote the legislation. This is the second. He wrote the legislation for the Anti-Corporation Farming Bill that was initiated by the Farmers Union in 1932. And the third is Roosevelt National Park.
So what would corporate ownership be?
In North Dakota?
That they're banning?
They were particularly concerned about the residue of the Northern Pacific Land Grant, much of which was, well, relatively speaking, not a whole lot, but some of which remained in corporate ownership. There's John Hancock is here. He showed me an old atlas of Grand Forks County, which had farmland that was owned by an insurance company, was it? Yep. And there were a lot of 1920s era mortgages that were defaulted to private banks, and so those lands were held by corporations. The law required divesting all of that. So this particular section of land that Jack and I know, which is just west of my place, was one of those parcels that had to be divested. There was also considerable concern about various kinds of what we would think of today as factory farms, particularly in potatoes. Most of Aroostook County, Maine, which is the second great potato producing area in the nation, is owned by a couple of companies which are actually packing potatoes. So potatoes in Maine are largely grown under contract on land that belongs to, not to the operator, but to the processor. So that's the kind of thing they were acting.
So the corporates, if divested, they had to be bought up, the parcels had to be bought up by individuals.
Yes, individuals. Now that law, we'll get to this in a minute, that law has been much amended, but it still bans corporate ownership of farmland. 1933, another attempt to ruin Sunday by permitting motion pictures. And finally, in 1934, motion pictures approved after 2 p.m. on Sundays by an absurdly small vote, small margin, but a very large turnout. That is the most votes ever cast in a North Dakota initiated referred measure. So we're 180 some thousand. In a state which had probably somewhere around 300,000 voters. A much younger state, remember, a lot more kids in that 700,000 people who lived in North Dakota in 1930 than there would be in the 700,000 people who are living in North Dakota now. We're older now than we were. So if I called this talk not as far back as you think, because I wanted to draw out these connections. If I were an historian, I probably would have called it something like casualty and recovery, because so many of the people that we've met came back. Lemke, Langer, Frazier, and so on. So the immediate impact really was kind of a reaction and refocus. The reaction against the League's radicalism produced a much more conservative group of elected officials. And then refocus by the progressives or the radicals away from state ownership toward the building of cooperatives. And to coming up with appealing referenda or initiated measures that would accomplish some of the things they wanted to do without having to go to the legislature to get it done. And corporation farming falls into that. So there's a realignment of political interest groups, the development of interest groups outside established parties, particularly, again, the Farmers Union. Emergence of individuals is the focus of political organization. Langer is the textbook case for this. One of the great misconceptions in North Dakota history is that the League has a continuous existence. Legally it had a continuous existence, but there is a sharp difference between the League that created the state-owned mill and elevator and the League that Bill Langer used as a personal political organization throughout the 1930s and 40s with varying degrees of success. So that by 1940, the focus of opposition to the League was opposition to Bill Langer, not opposition to the League's so-called socialist program. It became personal rather than philosophical. Personal vendetta as political motive. There was a lot of that in the 30s. We visited it with Sorley and Lemke, but it really became a much more important part of the state's politics after 1932. This, of course, is a topic for another decade, but Langer was removed from office and returned. There was an effort made to keep him out of the U.S. Senate. It's a real saga. An aggressive application of the use of initiative on a wide variety of issues. The opponents of the League went through the League program and initiated measures to repeal almost all of it. Some of these succeeded and some of them did not. Come on, get back here. And then, of course, this continuing effort to establish moral standards. Can you smoke? Can you go to a boxing match? Can you watch baseball on Sunday afternoon? Can you watch movies on Sunday afternoon? So the whole sort of what is Sunday for became a major kind of issue. One that is with us yet, of course, because it's only very recently, that shopping on Sunday morning has become legal. And not all that long ago when shopping on Sunday became legal at all. I think mid-'80s, if I don't remember for sure, but certainly within my relatively short lifetime. That would be within the last 70 years. I think that that whole Sunday thing deserves more attention. Lloyd Amdahl taught me in political science that there's no more interesting reading than an election abstract. So I'm going to go read the election abstracts with the returns for Sunday motion pictures. Who is voting against them? Besides my grandparents, of course. The lasting impact, I think, of the activity going on in the 20s, by lasting, I mean lasting into the next decade or so, is Langerism. Focus on political organization. This is something that is often overlooked. Langer built a political organization. The League built a political organization. The opponents of the League, the Independent Voters Association, built a political organization. Opponents of Langer in the 40s built a political organization. And it wasn't that they had necessarily the best candidates, the most attractive candidates. Milton Young, who was an organizer for the Republican Organizing Committee in the 40s, could hardly talk. He had a very serious stutter. But he was a superb organizer. And so there was a very razor-sharp focus on political organization, which is almost entirely lacking in today's politics. Today's politics happen on TV. They don't happen in neighborhood meetings the way they used to. The other really important thing that comes out of the 1920s going into the 30s is an increasing reliance on federal government. One of the League's cornerstone ideas was, we're going to make the economy work on our own. And in order to do that, we're going to have a bank, we're going to have an elevator, we're going to have all these kinds of institutions. The 1920s were very bad years in agriculture, nationally, and particularly in this part of the country. And so by the end of the 20s, when it began to dawn on people how serious this was, Murdock and Lemke began to look, and Frazier, began to look more toward the federal government. In, I think, 1926 or 27, the McNary-Haugen bill was introduced, one of the first farm programs. Frazier was a strong supporter. When Lemke was elected to the House in 1932, finally fulfilling his ambition for national office, he and Frazier began to sponsor a series of mortgage relief programs. The Frazier-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act. One of the reasons, perhaps the major reason, that Lemke ran for president in 1936 on the Union Party ticket was because Franklin Roosevelt steadfastly refused to sign the bankruptcy legislation that Lemke had managed to get passed. And so he developed a real animus toward FDR, which led him to join Father Coughlin on the Union Party ticket to run for president, a sort of nativist right-wing program of the kind that we are far too familiar with. Continuing impact. Now, by this I mean things that are still happening as a consequence of what began in the 1920s. One is the broader participation of women in politics. A second is the continuing assessment of the status of Sunday. What is Sunday supposed to be? The third is the ban on corporate farming, which continues, of course. and which was on the ballot most recently in 2016 after the legislature passed amendments to the bill that would have allowed corporations to own up to a section of land in order to support livestock operations. They had in mind feedlots and hog finishing, or feedlots. That was rejected by 75% of voters, actually close to 76% of voters in every county of the state, every legislative district. An overwhelming vote against rejecting this 1932 law. It had been on the ballot once before in 1968 after the legislature passed a complete repeal of the law. That was referred, and 75%, almost exactly the same margin, rejected the repeal. This is amazing because in 1932, it passed by about 57%. So the popularity of the ban on corporation farming grew over the decades, while the number of farmers fell precipitously. There were somewhere in the vicinity of 78,000 farms in North Dakota in 1930. Today, if you count twice, you might get close to 25,000. Closer to 20, I think. And many of those are separate units operated by the same person. So at the same time that farm numbers dropped by, what, from 80,000 to 20,000, support for banning farm corporations rose, not by the same rate, but at a significant rate. Why is this? The answer, I think, is that North Dakotans see corporation farming the same way that they see Sunday afternoon. It's a moral issue. It clearly has not been successful in keeping farms small. It has been successful in keeping farms family-owned, although the definition of family has been stretched over the years. It now includes second cousins. Now we're getting to the point where the same problem that faces the royal family. Who belongs? Well, the argument in favor of second cousins was brothers are farming, they each have children. Those children are second cousins because they have the same great-grandfather. But they can't farm together. They can't be members of the same farm corporation. One would have to be an employee. Now, this went to court. And the federal court found that, in fact, the North Dakota Anti-Corporation Farming Law does not violate the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. I'll just tell you that. I'm not going to try to explain it. Because it doesn't define the corporation as being a North Dakota corporation. In other words, if you and I are brothers, we can have a family corporation even if you live in Kentucky and I live in North Dakota. So, and even if we're second cousins, I live in Washington State and you live in Florida, we can still participate in that corporation. In other words, the initial notion was that we're going to keep those owners home, and we're going to keep the money they make home. But with the changes that have happened, that no longer prevails. But the notion that corporation farming should be banned remains one of those things that you really don't want to get into an argument about. I think that is the end. Questions? Thoughts?